Hello, I'm Dr. Shannon Farrell, and I'm the leader of the project entitled Mental Health Issues for Farmers, Their Families, and Their Communities. And while that may be a long title, our goal is simple. We just want to provide you with the resources that you need to improve your mental well-being. This project wouldn't have been possible without funding provided by USDA NEFA through the Southern Risk Management Education Center, and we're very grateful for their support. Suicide. It's a word that we hesitate to say out loud, and sometimes it's a word we even hesitate to think. Nevertheless, suicide is an issue that disproportionately impacts our rural communities. In today's presentation, Dr. Amanda Szarzynski provides you with information about suicide and what to do if someone you know may be contemplating it, even if that someone is you. As we go throughout today's presentation, it's important to underscore one of the facts that Dr. Szarzynski makes clear, and that is if you suspect that someone may be thinking about suicide, talk to them about it. Research has shown time and again that will not cause them to think about suicide if they weren't. In fact, that very intervention of asking about it may be exactly what they need to hear. And critically, with this video, immediately below you'll find a link to the National Suicide Helpline, along with other resources that can help you in a time of critical need. If you or someone you know is considering suicide, please take immediate advantage of the resources that we've provided along with this video. If, however, you've been watching this video to educate yourself, we would appreciate it if you'd take a moment to complete the brief survey that we've included along with the video.
Hi, my name is Amanda Szarzynski, and I am the Clinical Director of the Center for Family Services at Oklahoma State University. I've been asked to present to you about suicide awareness and prevention in the farming community. I do want to just start off by letting you know that I am not a farmer and I have never farmed, but I do come from a long line of farmers, and I specifically talked to my dad today and got permission to tell a few of his stories. My dad was a farmer his whole life up until I was probably around 10 years old. He actually went back to school and became a CPA, and then he's been in the ag lending business for over 25 years. So I have my toes kind of dipped in that area, and I'm really proud that my dad can be a representative of the farming community, as well as my grandparents who farmed for almost 50 years. So just a little bit of personal connection to this topic. So let's get started. So to start out with, I just want to tell you a little bit of just some numbers about suicide in our country. So as of 2015, which all of this data comes from the CDC and census data that was collected from 2001 to 2015. And so from that data, we found that suicide is in the top 10 leading causes of death in the United States. In those deaths, we know that there are 4 to 5 times more males than females that complete suicide. We also know that over the course of those 15 years or so, that white folks and American Native populations, those numbers really have gone up, more so than Hispanic or African American populations. We've also seen that the numbers have really gone up for rural areas, hence why we're having this presentation, right? We want to make those numbers go back down. So we've seen more numbers of suicide in rural areas versus the metropolitan cities. We've also seen from the data that the highest rates of suicide are among those that are aged 35 to 64, and that's males or females, but that age range of 35 to 64. And then most often, the mechanism that's used to complete a suicide are firearms. So how does that happen? Let's talk a little bit about farm culture and stress. I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here that you know all about what makes you stressed out and all about your culture, but just for the sake of review, for maybe those that are watching this to be helping the farming community, let's go over some things that really create farm culture. First and foremost, the thing that comes to my mind and what we know from the literature is that in this business, everything, for the most part, not everything, but a lot of things are out of your control. And so anything that can really inhibit your business, your farm, your practice, like weather, disease, pests, the market, all these things. We know that a lot of stress came from the Great Recession in 2008. So all of these things make farming really difficult because you can't control a lot of that and a lot of what's happening. And so you're just left kind of to react and respond to the best of your ability. Another aspect is that often in farming culture, there is an isolation factor, and that could be just geographically because you're out in the country, right? Like you're out on the farm, out on your land, which is going to be away at times from other people. And then that could also be, that could also cause some social isolation, not just geographical as well, when you're just far away from those, maybe a community or a town. Another aspect of farm culture that can sometimes lead to stress is that farmers tend to be self-reliant, independent, and really unlikely to ask for help. I asked my dad if he had any stories about this one, and he talked to me about when he was 22 years old. So he grew up farming his whole life. In fact, I've always heard stories that by the age of 7, he was chewing tobacco and driving a tractor. And, I think my grandpa probably confirmed that story a few times over the years. But at the age of 22, my grandparents were under a huge amount of stress because the bank was threatening to take away, well, not just threatening, they were at the point where they had to take away the farm and the homestead. And because it was a local bank who knew my family, they went to my dad and said, I know this is going to be hard on your parents, so we'd like for you to tell them and let them know. And so along with this, just kind of getting back to this point, my grandparents were so self-reliant. They didn't ask for help. They didn't want, to let anyone know that they were struggling. And it came down to the fact that they had to actually change their whole lifestyle. And so my dad was able to be an awesome son and step in and talk to my grandparents and talk to the bank and actually help them keep their homestead for a while as they made that transition out of farming culture and then moving into town. So that was a really tough story and a time when my dad really was able to kind of step in and help my grandparents in a time that they needed him most. So with that, we see that in farmers, there's this bootstrap mentality, right? Like we're just going to tough it out. And oftentimes that means putting your own health as a lower priority on the list. Your animals, your crops, your family, your land, all that stuff might come before your own health, whether that's mental health, physical health, any of that. Another aspect of farm culture and stress is that you are probably having to pay for your own out-of-pocket health insurance, which is really expensive. But also, it might just not be as big of a priority at times, which, just looking at how that could be a stress factor on your family. Next, we have some privacy concerns. So just really, I think it ties in nicely to that bootstraps mentality. Not only do we not want to ask for help, but we want to kind of keep it to ourselves. We want to keep it in the family. We don't want to advertise, what's going on. And like I said at the beginning, I did get permission from my dad to share that story about his family. So I was aware of those privacy concerns there. And then lastly, there may just be a shortage of mental health professionals or any kind of health professionals in rural communities. And so that can cause some stress and just be a part of farm culture that may contribute to bigger stress. And what I'm getting at is not just stress, but may lead to risk factors for suicide. So I've got 2 slides about stress. The first one is more just kind of some warning signs that some stress really may be creeping in and getting to be a problem. And then the second one is more about some chronic, prolonged stress and what that might look like. So let's start with the warning signs of stress. So some of the things you might see in the farming community if they're really starting to get stressed out is some change in routines. We know that farmers have a routine. They get up at the crack of dawn, maybe even before that, and start doing all the things that they need to do to keep their livelihood going. So that routine might start to look a little bit different. There might be a decline in caring for some of the domestic animals like dogs and cats around the property. There may be more illness happening. And we know that from lots of studies that your physical health is directly related and tied to your mental health. So if you're starting to feel pretty stressed out emotionally and mentally, then your body's going to start to take a toll as well. So having more illness. We may also see an increase in farm accidents due to stress. Less focus, more things on your mind may lead to some accidents. Another warning sign of stress is that there may be a decline in the appearance of the farmstead. As you can see, I've got a picture on this property of an old worn down building, an outbuilding of some kind. And so we may see that there's a decline in the farmstead just because that tends to get lower on the priority list if you're not feeling too well. We also might see signs of stress in children. I'm sure those of you that have kids know that they can sense anything that you're going through. So if you're stressed, they're probably going to start to exhibit signs of stress as well. And then lastly for this slide, just looking at some warning signs of stress, is just a general decrease in interest. So that could be interest in your work, it could be interest in your relationships, in your social activities that you typically participate in. You're just kind of generally less interested. And that could be a sign that you're starting to get pretty stressed out. And then continuing with signs of stress, these are some signs of chronic prolonged stress. And so by chronic, what we mean by that is that it's going over a long amount of time. It's just chronic. It's like you just can't get past feeling stressed out. It's maybe even been going on for years. And so if that's happening, then you might see some of these symptoms, which are, again, those physical aches and illnesses, specifically ulcers, headaches, and then being sick. I know for a fact both of my grandparents had ulcers, and then my dad had ulcers, and then I'm not even a farmer, and somehow I inherited ulcers. Thank you very much, Dad. But that can be a sign of prolonged stress. Another sign of chronic stress is just general irritability and bitterness, just kind of being in a bad mood all the time. Your family might feel like they are a little on eggshells, like they don't want to approach you because you're just not in a very good mood. Another thing is just depression and sadness. So just feeling low, feeling fatigued, like you don't want to get out of bed in the morning. That could be a sign of chronic stress. And then take that irritability and bitterness and then go a step further, and it could lead to anger. And I want to just say it's okay to feel angry, especially if things are happening outside of your control. But if it gets to that place of violence and rage and, more uncontrolled anger, that would be signs of a problem. We also see that exhaustion and sleep problems can be a symptom of chronic and prolonged stress. And maybe you chuckled when I said that. Of course you're exhausted. Everybody's exhausted. I can't imagine a farmer that isn't exhausted. But just remember, these are going to be not just one of these symptoms, but probably a whole group of them. And it's going to be over a long amount of time. And so bad that it's probably interrupting your daily functioning. So kind of keep that in mind, that if you have one of these things, it's not the end of the world, but it is something that you should be mindful of and start taking care of yourself to maybe fix that. Another sign of chronic prolonged stress is loss of humor, loss of spirit. And I know if any of you are like my grandparents or my dad, that sense of humor, being able to joke around on the farm is really what kind of kept their spirits high when times were bad. So if you're starting to see a loss of humor, a loss of spirit, kind of not feeling like yourself, or even when things are good, then that could be a sign of chronic stress. We may also see memory loss, lack of concentration, and just difficulty making decisions. And I think this is related to maybe some anxiety, just things constantly being on your mind, and then you add physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion, then we start to see your brain just not functioning as well as it usually does. Then another sign of chronic stress is just a general lack of self-confidence and self-judgment. So seeing maybe some lower self-esteem, feeling like you're not worthy, not enough, like you're never doing good enough, and that you're feeling maybe like a failure. These are all things that could really start to be a sign of chronic stress. And then lastly, substance abuse. And with this, I don't mean cracking open a beer after a long day. This is abuse, where it is, drinking or drug use of some type that is so much so that it's interrupting your daily functioning, and maybe even also disrupting your relationships with your family, or impacting your physical health. So if it's starting to interrupt your life in different ways, then we're talking about substance abuse. Okay, some warning signs and risk factors of suicide. So far, just to kind of summarize and backtrack a little bit, we talked about farm culture and how some aspects of that culture are going to lead to stress. And then what are those warning signs? What are those symptoms? What are those things that we're going to see when people are really starting to feel stressed out, and not just one day or 1 week, but prolonged stress? And then when we have so much stress, then what are those warning signs and factors that could potentially lead to suicide? And we want to know those things so that then we can prevent it, right? So some warning signs. This is a common acronym that was put out by suicidelifeline.org, and it's called Is Path Warm? And so I'm going to go through and explain each one of these letters of this acronym. The first one, is ideation. And really all that means is that someone is thinking about, has maybe made a threat, or has communicated in some way that they're feeling suicidal. And that could sound like, maybe it would be better if I just didn't wake up tomorrow. Or it could be a little bit more aggressive than that, and saying, I should just take my gun out and get this over with. So these are some ideation types of ways of thinking or comments that you might hear from someone who is feeling suicidal. The S stands for substance abuse, and I just talked about that a little bit on the last one. But again, this is excessive substance abuse, or even if you see an increase in substance abuse, so some kind of major change. The P in PATH stands for purposelessness. And so with that, just not feeling like you have a sense of purpose, not feeling like you have a reason to go on, a reason for living. If someone's experiencing that, they may be at risk for suicide. The A stands for anxiety, and this could manifest in a bunch of different ways. It could look like they're just agitated all the time. Maybe they're a little bit removed because their mind is always racing, or maybe they're having a hard time sleeping because they have insomnia and they just cannot fall asleep because their mind won't shut down. These are just a few examples of what anxiety could look like. The T in PATH stands for trapped, which is just feeling like there's no way out. And I could imagine if, maybe my grandparents felt that way when the bank notes just kept coming in and all these factors out of their control, just kept piling up. I would imagine they started to feel pretty trapped. Luckily, they had a good support system around them that helped them to transition out of that feeling. But I could see how someone in their position could really start to feel that way. The H is hopelessness. And that's pretty self-explanatory, right? You know what it's like to feel hopeless. I think we've all felt that at times. But again, this is a prolonged or even just a big increase in that feeling. And then we get to the warm part of Is Path Warm, and the W stands for withdrawing. And so if you notice that someone is starting to really isolate themselves and withdraw from their friends, from their family, from different social events, like maybe they stop going to church, they stop going to the potluck, they stop going to, the farmer's market, whatever that might be, but you start to see that they're just withdrawing. The A in warm stands for anger. And I mentioned this a little bit before, but this is uncontrolled anger. So again, it's okay to feel angry, but this, when we're talking about risk factors and warning signs of suicide, is really more related to an uncontrolled feeling of anger. So we're seeing more rage, maybe some revenge-seeking behaviors and things like that. Then the R stands for recklessness. So this is if someone starts engaging in risky behaviors, they're not really thinking through things, maybe having some impulsive thoughts and things that they're doing, then this recklessness can be really dangerous if you have a number of these other factors going on at the same time. And then the M stands for mood changes. And you notice on the slide it says dramatic mood changes. So just because someone's really sad one day doesn't necessarily mean that it's a warning sign. But what we could see is, and actually I'll just tell a quick story. I had a client years ago who was very depressed for a long time. And then for a couple weeks, he actually just was kind of magically happy. It's like he had just snapped out of his depression and his mood was just very bright and cheery. And it was that dramatic mood change that actually was a warning sign that he was preparing to commit suicide. Because sometimes, I think we often think that if a warning sign of suicide is that someone is going to be just really dive down and be really low. Well, sometimes if someone's already been contemplating suicide and then they make that plan and they're ready to go through with that plan, it actually lifts their spirits because they feel like, they're going to finally get some relief of some sort. So sometimes a warning sign might be that they're actually in a great mood out of the blue. So just be mindful of that this is any kind of dramatic mood change. So just to refresh on all of those, is path warm? And so just try to remember that acronym. I know that especially after supervising and having a couple clients in the past that have completed suicide, this is one of those things that I try to just burn into my brain so that I'm aware of all the warning signs and factors that could potentially lead someone to commit suicide. Some other risk factors to keep in mind is that males, I mentioned this earlier, but males tend to complete suicide more often, and women tend to attempt suicide more often. And this is because males tend to choose more lethal means. So just be aware that that could be a factor. And along with that, especially in the farming community, access to firearms combined with all of these other factors that we've been discussing could be a risk factor. Being isolated geographically, reducing their activity, physical problems, those are all things that we've talked about already as signs of stress. And then a previous suicide attempt. That is one of the biggest risk factors for a completed suicide, is that someone has attempted before. So just be mindful if you know that someone has already attempted in the past and then you're starting to see some of these warning signs, it's time to get them some help if they're not getting help already. And then the last couple things in terms of risk factors are a feeling of failure and then having a specific suicidal plan. So if someone has a plan and then you combine it with some of these other things, then that's something to be mindful of, again, to get them some help. So what do you do? So you kind of learned all about stress and how that can manifest and what that looks like in yourself or maybe your friends or family members. We know some warning signs of suicide. So what do you do if you see these things? Well, the Suicide Prevention Lifeline has broken it down into 3 key things, and that's to ask, listen, and act. And first of all, I just want to say, I think there's a myth out there that if we talk to someone about suicide, that it's going to put that idea into their mind. That's not true at all. We actually know from tons of data and tons of research that talking about suicide with someone who is feeling suicidal can actually prevent them from going through with it. So it's better to bring it out into the open, as uncomfortable as it might be, and talk about it. And you might be that one who listens and puts it out there, and then someone can kind of just go, oh, I'm so glad I could finally say that out loud. So don't be afraid to bring it up if you're worried. It's better to ask or talk about it and then it be nothing, and then you go about your day, than to not say anything. So with that, when you ask, you want to ask the person directly if they are having suicidal thoughts or ideas. And then the second thing is ask them if they have a plan. So we know that that's a risk factor, right? So do you have a plan, a specific plan? And then 3, do they have access to the lethal means to go through with that plan? So 3 things. Are you feeling suicidal? Do you have a plan? And do you have access to go through with your plan? Those are really 3 important questions to ask if you think that someone might be suicidal. And then for listen, you want to listen for all those red flags that we've talked about on the last couple slides. So thinking about those is path warm factors and looking for anything that might lead to suicidal behavior. And then act. So you've done all these things, you've asked someone else how they're feeling, if they have a plan, and if they have access to lethal means. You're listening, being a good listening ear for them. And if you think that someone might harm him or herself, do not leave them alone. You say, I'm going to get you some help. I'm going to get some help right now. And hopefully you have a phone with you. If not, get one nearby. And you can call 911 or your local police and tell them what's going on. You can also call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and I've got the number there on the slide. But that is also an acronym in case you need to try to remember that. It's 1-800-273-TALK. You could also text the word HOME to 741-741 to connect someone with a crisis counselor, and that's 24/7. And then if you are maybe a farmer who is feeling stressed out, might be feeling suicidal, but not to that point where you have a plan or you're ready to go through with that plan. Maybe you're just feeling really stressed out and you would like to talk to someone who understands. Then you can call the farmer hotline with Farm Aid at 1-800-FARM-AID. But just so you know, those phone lines are only open Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern. So those are a few specific resources that you can call. But if you can't remember anything else, just call 911. Call someone and get help if you think that someone is in danger. So I just want to thank you for taking the time to learn more about how you can help the farming community. I hope this has been helpful for you and that you'll remember some of these signs of stress and risk factors for suicide and hopefully save a life. Thanks.